Okay, so in this section, I want to focus on how water related issues and international and civil conflict are connected. And I thought I would start today in a non traditional way, a bit looking at how water might be related to the causes of issues without necessarily being at the heart of it, and then get more into those areas in which conflict and water are more directly related. And this reminds me of the way that natural resources, water, territory, geography, long term rivalries can all interact in some really interesting and I find novel ways. So this painting is one from Juan Lepiani of the Battle of Arica in 1880. It is immortalizing war, or the War of the Pacific in Spanish, La Guerra en el Pacífico, between Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. And it shows how economic interests, geography, and the unanticipated relationships between geography and economic productions can lead to conflict. I haven't been able to actually get my hands on an actual real version of this game. I definitely would be interested in it for those of you who are interested in strategy, international relations kind of games. Anyway, the War of the Pacific, most of it was in 1879 and in 1880, and it basically started from differences about taxation across countries in companies, escalated to countries, and it ended up drawing in an ally, which had made a secret alliance with one of the conflicted parties. So to make sure that I get it right, so in February 1878, Bolivia imposed a new tax on a Chilean mining company, CSFA. Despite Bolivian agreements beforehand a couple years earlier, as part of one of their boundary treaties in 1874, that it wouldn't increase taxes on Chilean businesses or people for 25 years after that. Chile protested, submitted it to mediation. Bolivia rejected those mediation efforts and said that it should be dealt with in Bolivian courts. Chile insisted. Um, the When the Bolivian state tried to enforce the collection of the taxes and seize the corporate interests in Bolivia, Chile responded by occupying a seaside town of Antofagasta. Peru, which had less than a decade earlier signed a secret alliance with Bolivia, tried to mediate. The Chileans escalated. Chile declared war on both countries after Bolivia and Peru went to back down. And there were initial naval battles off the coast because back then Bolivia had access to the Pacific, the territory on the Pacific. Initial naval battles ended up being battles between the Bolivian and Chilean armies. Chile won both of those major areas. There were low-lying skirmishes with the Peruvians for a couple of years afterwards. But in the end, there was a peace agreement, and Chile won a large swath of territory from Bolivia and some from Peru as well. And this area was of interest, and the ties in to water because this area had one of the most important resources of that time, which was seabird guano. That back in the 19th century, before synthetic fertilizers were developed, sources of seabird guano and bat guano were worth quite a lot of money. You might, in your studies of Pacific Island states, have seen the gold rush for guano rush for control of small island nations because of millennia of seabirds living in areas, doing what they do, and having the excrement build up, along with the other detritus of their living there, ended up creating a really nitrite rich output that could be used to create fertilizer. So Bolivia lost this really important natural resource, also lost access to the ocean. Similar to the fight between Ethiopia and what became the sovereign nation of Eritrea, Eritrea took the border territory, which has proven crucial for their ability to access international markets and has caused challenges with trying to become a sovereign nation, similar to South Sudan declaring independence, but they don't have any kind of tie to the ocean. And so South Sudan, even after fighting decades of war with Sudan, ended up having to reach agreements with the Sudanese government to build and maintain existing pipelines from South Sudan to the coast to be able to allow for exports of their oil. So natural resources and access to the ocean can be crucial and driving forces for conflict, as well as one of the more costly outcomes of having a conflict. Now, you would think a 19th century conflict would be long in the rearview mirror for these countries. Yeah, this is just a geographic breakdown that shows this thin sliver of territory that Bolivia lost and ceded to Chile. But if you visit Bolivia in Antofagasta, in that area, you can see here that one day what was once ours will be ours again. This is a mural of a Bolivian soldier stabbing a Chilean soldier in the neck. So there's still hard feelings there, and it can lead. These kind of conflicts can lead to long-term and enduring rivalries. Indeed, one of the major issues during that conflict in the 19th century was the fact that Chile had been relatively more successful than Bolivia or Peru in economically developing and being relatively stable. And so there was efforts of trying to knock them down a bit. More generally, you can look at the literature for today, which we're going to be talking more about in the workshop, links between water and subnational conflict as well as international conflict, and the possibility for these conflicts over time. A couple of the causal processes that could link water to conflicts that the literature highlights is that water could accentuate social divides, right? That harkening back to Homer Dixon, that water could accentuate how large of a proportion of the goods that can be generated in a given area. A lack of water could lead to human suffering and grievances, which could lead to motivations for violence. We're going to be looking at this a bit more in the Omo region, spanning Ethiopia and Kenya a bit more next week. With this relative scarcity has the follow-on effects of reducing opportunity costs for joining groups that are willing to use violence, similar to what we've seen in earlier weeks. And the Thiessen, Holderman, and Buhaug article talks about how the risks for conflict are highest when scarcity overlaps with political and economic marginalization. And this should not be that surprising. We're going to see this with a bunch of other economic and social issues that central governments find it easier, like with the urbanization discussion a few weeks ago, that it's easier to provide resources if people are relatively geographically concentrated, as well as easier to keep tabs on them. Governments have different cultural or social basis for support, and so once they get into power, there can be big differences in overall level of development as the government pours resources into certain areas that might be crucial for them maintaining power. When I think of that, I think of Mobutu Sese Seko in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who basically created this second capital city. He spent a lot of time up in the northern part of the country, where he built a mansion, base of support, where he came from and his group. So if you provide resources in certain parts of the country, you marginalize or minimize the resources that might go to other parts of the country, which can cause dissatisfaction. Could also escalate to conflict. So yeah, the water is another one of those resources that can provide motivations for conflict, and often a crucial one. Looking at more international areas for potential tension, and again, this is going to be linked into next week's discussion as well, is the efforts to try to make the most out of the Nile water resources that originates up in Lake Victoria and then flows northwards all the way to Alexandria and to the Mediterranean in the north. You can see here, I think, which is really interesting, how it's not, you don't have to just dam a resource once. You can have a number of dams over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. Over time, you see more and more dams being created on the Nile, the White Nile, the Blue Nile. And some of these have been crucial to certain countries' economic growth and production. Aswan Dam is one that I think of with Egypt, and with the Gerd Dam in Ethiopia. That is another one of those. I don't think that's actually in here. Oh yeah, the Renaissance Dam, which is in progress in Ethiopia, is another one that holds a great possibility for increasing electrical output in both Ethiopia, as well as their ability to sell it to neighboring countries. But can also cause dissatisfaction if the water gets held back and there's not enough water for agricultural production downstream. This is an issue we're going to see in the Central Asian case in just a little bit. But as you can see, geography is destiny in certain ways, because you have this river system and river basin that stretches across a number of different countries in some of the poorest countries in the world, in which you have climate changing and rainfall becoming more unstable, which increases the dependence on a regular source of water from rivers like the Nile. And I think this made me think in the Greek reading, they mentioned this Latin quote that I think resonated for me for a lot of the natural resources that we cover in this class. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin. My school didn't have Latin. I don't know how many schools have Latin these days, but in English, use your property in a way not to injure others, right? And there's a drilling operation here for water, but as you probably already know, the water table doesn't necessarily have lines underneath the ground as it has on top of the ground. And so if you draw an excess amount of water from your territory, you can hurt your neighbors. And I snuck in the last video after this in the backgrounders for Central Asia. I included a video of Daniel Day-Lewis doing an amazing acting job in There Will Be Blood, in which he talks about how he drank the other prospector's milkshake by taking the oil from his competitor's ground. Same thing applies also to water usage, and we're going to see this in the Central Asian case. Now, where water falls, there's this huge literature on precipitation. Back in week 1 or week 2, when we looked at the Miguel et al. Paper looking at rainfall patterns and conflict, rainfall being exogenous, and Ken Schultz and his co-author saying not so fast, how you measure rainfall can also affect this link with conflict. You see that there has been certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the darker parts, that have gotten wetter since the 1950s, and then the white areas are ones that are considerably drier. And the Sahel is definitely one of those places. In the Sahara Desert, and you see also places in Eastern Africa, right, getting into Sudan and Ethiopia have also gotten significantly drier, and that links into droughts and how droughts might exacerbate conflict. And we talked about the Syrian case study, how Syria experienced one of the worst droughts of millennia, and how that drove people to central to Damascus and other urban centers, and that helped spark the protests that led to the war there. And from the Thiessen article, you see how there really isn't the kind of strong relationship between drought and conflict directly. They look at a whole bunch of different measures of drought. The important thing is to not understand the statistical ways that these things are different, are measured. The importance is, again, with these articles, that you're looking at the substantive importance. And what that is if you look at the x-axis, the relative risk of civil war onset, things that increase and that are above the line increase the risk of conflict, and the ones that are below the line decrease. But those bars are the confidence intervals of 95% confidence intervals around that. And if those confidence intervals cross the line, relative risk, it's around 1. The absolute probability, it's around 0. And what you see is the pure measures of drought aren't really, except for the one down in the bottom, and there's one that's almost there with a rainfall deviation from the mean, that there isn't that much statistical evidence for a direct relationship. And that is consistent with a lot of literature that we've looked at in this class, that these environmental conditions are background effects that exacerbate existing political, economic, or social disparities, and then that can help trigger conflict, that it's a background condition more than the kind of direct relationship. Other ways that water can link to international conflicts. The Gleditch et al. Piece for this week talked about rivers leading to fuzzy boundaries. And I mentioned in the earlier video about the Colorado River. River systems change over time. Climate change can make them fluctuate. Random changes in the riverbank can change over time. I used to live in New Orleans near the Mississippi River, and basically every boat that headed up the Mississippi River had to have a pilot, because even though there's good information you can get from satellite data or from GPS, the river is a living and moving entity. So you need people who have that local knowledge on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis to see how it actually can change. And so those fuzzy boundaries can lead certain states to try to move and solidify control once it might be in that time period that might temporarily benefit them. And so these things can change over time. Makes me think of the current standoff between China and India, in which you have small groups of military personnel using the fuzziness and the lack of settled boundaries between the two states to try to seek long-term advantage through short-term movements of people. Water scarcity. The second point, water scarcity can lead to conflict through access or equitable distribution. We're going to see this with the Central Asian case, in which you need just access to a certain amount of water to be able to survive, but then also a percentage distribution to make sure that you have some planning for what the percentage, how much you're actually going to get once you actually have that. And there's a whole literature on this for how these international agreements are negotiated and how the percentages are estimated. Third point, the risk is higher in areas of changing patterns of rainfall or political governance. right? One thing that we've seen in this class is that change brings uncertainty, and that if rainfall patterns become uncertain, that can lead to an upending of a relatively stable system because the resource itself is become less stable, and that can lead to some jockeying for renegotiation. And often it's can be a power play for who tries to renegotiate and what they actually ask for. And the last one, levels of economic development matter, right? I mentioned in the last video that over 90% of sub-Saharan African agriculture is not irrigated, and that increases the susceptibility to these kind of rainfall changes. And with greater levels of development, you have ability to provide the spending to either mitigate or adapt to change, or to be able to compensate those who are being more at risk or paying the costs of the changing levels of rainfall or access to water, and levels of development also to kind of make these huge infrastructural spending products like the GERD Dam in Ethiopia to be able to benefit. So it can cost money to be able to have that security for water production, as well as a lot of other issues that we've covered in this class. And this links to this multi-step process to back to good old Homer Dixon 94 in the article, as well as for the 99 book, that water has an effect on all three of these sources of environmental scarcity. At least as I could tell a story to myself, that happens. That water decreases the quality. Water resources can decrease in quality through microplastics, through seawater, brackish seawater, getting into areas that were formerly just fresh water for agriculture. And the quantity can just decrease as those glaciers disappear. Their water outflow can decrease. Water is shaped by population growth. More people need more water. Issue in Las Vegas and LA, as I've already said, and unequal access. How that pie is distributed can lead to relative dissatisfaction between, as we're going to see in the Omo region in Ethiopia and Kenya next week, between herders and agriculturalists, or just through farmers or economic production across states, as we're going to see in the Central Asia in a second. So this is the Gleditch article for this week, which we're going to talk a bit more about later. One of the main findings that I wanted to draw your attention to in their empirical findings related to development and conflict, that states are more likely to have a dispute that leads to fighting and leads to people dying in areas that are in the middle share of economic development. If two countries share a common river border, share a river basin, they're not highly economically developed, right? Like Germany and her neighbors, or not extremely poor. Those ones that are in the middle level of development are the only places where those confidence intervals don't overlap. In that space between -2 and 0 or so, I think they would argue that that's an inverted U relationship between development and the likelihood of a dispute, which I think is really, it's 90% confidence intervals. I think that's interesting that, like with political institutions that we already learned in this course, that the extremes can in some ways be more stable than the ones that are in the middle. And what this doesn't really estimate is how quickly the development is changing. It's just more those states that are in the middle range of economic development are more likely to have disputes. So how does water become a source for rivalry? This turning to the Glick article. The degree of scarcity. If there's enough to go around, then there isn't as much incentive to have a conflict. How many groups have to share the resource? Like with the Nile, the more and I'm sure you've covered collective action problems. If you haven't read Mentz or Olson's, or haven't talked about collective action problems, the more states have to negotiate, more actors have to negotiate, the harder it can be to actually reach an agreement. And so bilateral water talks can be easier than multilateral ones. Relative power of the states, right? The overall level of development in the Gleditch article didn't really differentiate between if it's one really rich state negotiating with a very poor neighbor. That gives more bargaining power to the richer state to be able to get their ideal point. Are there alternatives to fresh water sources? If there's a river on one side, but then there's other water sources that can be redistributed, kind of like the LA aqueduct, then that would give more flexibility to be able to negotiate solutions. And the impacts to water development, if you have to negotiate these, that could have an impact for long-term development in certain areas. There have been technical issues to try to deal with these kind of scarcities. I know Saudi Arabia and Israel are at the forefront, and I think Australia has a couple of pilot projects for desalination plants to try to deal with alternatives to having to depend on fresh water sources. But economically, it hasn't reached that stage to give a true alternative to negotiating with other actors. So this leads me, and so there's a lot more that we can talk about. We're going to be talking about more of this in the workshop, but I think it is theoretically and empirically important to kind of think about the relationships between the different factors that we're looking at in this class, right? Is the relationship going one direction? Is it linear? As development goes up, conflict goes down, or as political change goes up, conflict goes up. So is the relationship linear or nonlinear? Here, do you think the relationship of water scarcity and conflict is linear or nonlinear? So in that plot, they're talking about level of development. There's being a non-linear relationship in areas that they share a common boundary. But I'd be interested to see what you think about water scarcity and conflict. Do you think that relationship is linear, that as water becomes more scarce, the probability of conflict either at a low level or at an international level gets higher? Or is that relationship also kind of a inverted U, or maybe a U shape, that highly scarce and highly abundant countries have a higher level of conflict because there's more to fight over when you have lots of water, or if it's really scarce, then you have lots of incentive to try to scrape and get what you can get? Or is the relationship the other direction, that relatively abundant and states they have incentive to work together because there's enough to go around, and in scarce states, people don't have the energy and time to focus on battles. They just have to try to focus on survival, and that it's maybe those countries that have enough resources to have these interests and the ability to act on them. So is the relationship linear, that you can go, the relationship between scarcity and conflict goes up, or is it a U or upside down U relationship? Please answer the question on the lecture, question number 2 on Waddle. And we're going to turn now to the study of Central Asia and see how these kind of water relationships have played out in a part of the world that some of you might not have come across before, but it highlights a couple of issues related to water subnationally as well as internationally. So please answer the lecture question, and then we'll get to the next video.